Hell is Real, and it was programmed by Yuji Naka. It's Segaiden episode 93. Let's pause for a moment to contemplate something of a landmark moment in the VideoWorks chronology. Ghouls and Ghosts for Genesis is something we haven't yet seen in the VideoWorks chronology, a Capcom game released on non-NES hardware. Okay, so I'm fudging a little here. This is not the first Capcom game ever to show up outside of the NES by any means, just the first that has appeared in my chronology, which admittedly has been a little achronological in places. By summer 1989, Capcom had spread its games across countless home computer platforms, primarily in Europe. And here in the US, the company's arcade hit Commando had shown up on many more systems than just the NES. INTV published a brave, if futile, take on Commando for Intellivision in December 1987. And that was followed by the June 1988 release of a 2600 version. The one actually worth playing, the audio-enhanced 7800 port, would arrive in November 1989. Now, these alternate releases share one interesting fact in common. None of them were actually developed by Capcom, nor did Capcom publish them. Each and every one was licensed out to external partners. Something that stands out about these US console releases is that Commando was the only Capcom title to make its way to those systems. Meanwhile, in arcades, Commando was the only Capcom coin-op to have been licensed and distributed in the US by Data East. This leads me to suspect that Data East, not Capcom, took the initiative in licensing the game to INTV and Activision. And something similar likely happened with the European computer releases of other Capcom properties, like Bionic Commando, given the way rights were shoveled around between different licensors back then. I mean, just look at the mess of sub-licensing that is RoboCop. Ghouls and Ghosts for Genesis stands out because it indisputably has its origins in Japan, emerging from a partnership between Capcom and Sega. Now, to be fair, this version was also not developed or published by Capcom staff, but it was handled entirely by Sega. In other words, this cartridge resulted from an initiative between two corporations in Japan. It wasn't something that overseas licensors finessed. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, this isn't that big a deal, but as an event in the 1989 gaming space, it is kind of significant. In a lot of ways, I see Capcom as a bellwether for the shifting winds of Japan's console business as the 8-bit era gave way to the uncertainties of the 1990s. Remember that Capcom got its start shortly after the Famicom arrived on the scene, and the company produced its first coin-op release in late 1984 as the Famicom began to ascend to dominance. Capcom released its first Famicom cartridge, 1942, a year later, and it was a huge hit. A year after that, Capcom would be one of the first 3 licensees for the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. The company would land some massive arcade hits in the years ahead, but in a lot of ways, it was the company's great results as a Nintendo licensee that put them in the position to become competitive with the likes of Namco and Sega. And for several years, Capcom published its games exclusively on NES and Famicom, and the company got pretty damn good at it. By the time Genesis launched, they had arguably established themselves as the premier third party for NES. But that exclusivity changed in December 1988 when Hudson and NEC launched the CD-ROM expansion to PC Engine and shipped 2 games alongside it. The first, Noriko, was basically a parasocial breakthrough, an interactive profile on a popular teen music idol. Besides laying the groundwork for today's VTuber whales, Noriko didn't really have much impact on the future of gaming. But the other launch title, Fighting Street, well, I'll get there soon enough. But that was a Capcom arcade conversion at the launch of a new accessory for Nintendo's chief competitor in the home space, which promised to give Hudson and NEC a definitive technical edge over Famicom. That's kind of a big deal considering Nintendo and Capcom's close relationship. It would be like, I don't know, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy abandoning the Nintendo ecosystem in favor of an up-and-coming rival's platform. Just unthinkable betrayal. Well, not exactly betrayal, but Capcom's willingness to play ball with other console makers did land quite a bit differently than, say, Hudson or Namco or Konami setting up shop on other systems. Namco had been at odds with Nintendo ever since the latter decided to implement a formal Famicom licensing scheme. Hudson had worked closely with Nintendo without ever really being beholden to Famicom. They had, after all, begun life as a computer company and even brought Nintendo properties to PC. And Konami, well, let's be honest, Konami never met a platform it didn't want to put its games on. When you license properties to the Gawken TV boy, I don't think anyone looks to you for steadfast platform monogamy. But Capcom, straying beyond Famicom, that was kind of a big deal in my opinion. Nintendo had held the Japanese console biz in a hammerlock for half a decade by the time Fighting Street stumbled its way to PC Engine. But the rapid uptake of Hudson's system in Japan proved that even Nintendo couldn't hold the lead forever. And loyalists, like Capcom, began to look askance as their Famicom sales numbers began to sag. The explosive popularity of the NES in America certainly gave third parties plenty of incentive to continue development for the Nintendo platform, and I suspect that helped prop up the Famicom back home in Japan. Still, the writing was on the wall, and more capable consoles, with more cutting-edge appeal, were here to push Famicom to the periphery. At this point, you're preparing to post a testy comment about how this video was supposed to have been about Ghouls and Ghosts for Genesis, not Nintendo third-party politics. To you, I say, welcome, new viewer. Sit back and enjoy my shaggy dog stories. We've just about arrived at the point. See, for my money, the arrival of Ghouls and Ghosts on Genesis marked the industry's first true vote of confidence in Sega's new console. I mean, we've seen Sega pump out ports of their own arcade games, and they locked down the support of esoteric computer developers like Technosoft. But when Capcom hands Sega the keys to one of the hottest arcade titles of the year and says, "Go for it, guys," that's something else entirely. Now, admittedly, it would be another 4 years before Capcom actually threw their own internal resources behind Genesis development. Until Street Fighter II belatedly made its way to the console, any Capcom property you saw on Genesis was in fact a Sega-developed and Sega-published affair. So it's not a huge change in terms of logistics from the Master System approach, where Sega functioned as nearly the sole publisher and handled most development itself, either internally or through trusted white-label partners. But it's a big change in terms of symbolism. Capcom represented a huge step upward in terms of partners, and Ghouls and Ghosts was a big deal. Maybe bigger even than Double Dragon for Master System? Certainly in terms of timeliness, popularity, and arcade fidelity combined, Ghouls and Ghosts is quite possibly the biggest thing ever to hit a Sega console that didn't have its origins in Sega's own studios. This was, hands down, the system seller for Sega in 1989, both in Japan and the US. The media in both countries couldn't say enough good about it, or devote sufficient inches of page copy to fully convey their excitement. Sure, Altered Beast had looked great, but it was only fun for a few minutes. Space Harrier 2 was strong, but that property was pretty well worn and the sequel didn't offer much new over previous releases. Thunder Force 2 played great, but its visuals lacked the immediate system-selling sizzle that made for a compulsory Toys R Us demo station conversion. But Ghouls and Ghosts had it all. A great name, great visuals, and good gameplay. Oh, and the original Ghosts'N Goblins had been a huge hit on NES. For American Nintendo nuts, this was the first sign that they would need to look beyond NES for continuity of experiences, and that Sega was the company to bring them the next iterations of the game sensations that they had grown to love on Nintendo's system. Now, at the same time, this port was undeniably a Sega game. And by that, I mean it's unreasonably difficult. I mean, difficult is really something of a given for a game in this series. It's kind of its thing. But this specific port of Ghouls and Ghosts cranks it up to a heretofore unimagined level, demanding players' utmost skill, endurance, and tolerance for abuse. We should probably get this out of the way up front. Heck, maybe I should have led with this for the entire video. Ghouls and Ghosts demonstrates the fact that Sega still hadn't quite moved beyond their arcade-first mentality at this point. The company had not collectively accepted the fact that home video games represent a different economic model than coin-op titles. Consumers pay for a console game up front. You don't have to make them suffer in the name of earning a coin drop every 3 minutes on average. Which is not to say that home games have to be toothless or anything, but they also don't have to be tuned to be harder than the arcade version. And yet Ghouls and Ghosts was. For this, we look to Sega's star programmer Yuji Naka, who handled this conversion fresh off of trying to make Super Thunderblade a minimal viable product. Naka clearly knew his business at this point, as he so ably demonstrated with his 3D dungeon work in Phantasy Star. He's been quoted as crediting his time in the Ghouls conversion mines as an instrumental experience for designing his masterpiece, Sonic the Hedgehog, as it taught him how to handle non-orthogonal surfaces like slopes. Given his pedigree and overall technical competence, I have to assume that the tweaks he implemented here were in fact deliberate for some reason. The issue here all boils down to collision detection. In arcades, Ghouls and Ghosts worked a little bit like modern manic shooters, where protagonist Arthur could graze hazards and come away okay. As long as they didn't smack against his core, he could slip past without trouble. But on Genesis, Arthur's collision detection begins not at his core, not at the outlines of his sprite, but rather at the bounding box of his sprite. If something seemingly whiffs past him, but impacts against the transparent pixels of his sprite tiles, it sometimes counts as a hit. There was once a great image post on a site that used to be called Twitter, which compared Arthur taking damage on Genesis versus how impacts worked in the arcade and on Super Graphics. But sadly, it seems to have vanished into the ether. Still, I found in my playtime for this recording that this claim bears out. You'll be amazed by the kind of near misses that murder Arthur here. It's not always consistent, and it seems to mostly affect projectiles rather than enemy mobs, but it's enough to make a crazy hard game even crazy harder. Not that it needed the help. I gotta be honest, this masochist style of game design is not my cup of murder, but I can see the appeal, especially when it's tied to a game that does such an impressive job of bringing the arcade machine home. Yes, fine, in retrospect, you can see what a downgrade the Genesis version of Ghouls and Ghosts was from the coin-op. These days, you can actually dig up the arcade version for play as easily as the home port. These were unavoidable compromises. Capcom built Ghouls and Ghosts for its shiny new CPS-1 platform, an arcade board that superficially seems like a faster version of the Genesis. It had a nearly identical architecture to the Genesis, running on a Motorola 68000 clocked about 30% faster, supported by a Z80 subprocessor, and blasting its tunes from a Yamaha sound chip. Just like Sega's console. Except that the CPS also boasted a pair of custom coprocessors that Capcom refers to as super chips, which boosted the basic processor's visual capabilities far beyond anything you could manufacture and still sell on a console gaming budget. The mighty Sharp X68000 was more or less a home computer built around the CPS standard, and it cost about $2,500 at launch, roughly 12 times the price of a Genesis. The Genesis may have been the beefiest console on the US market in 1989, but even it couldn't compete with the color depth and super high horizontal resolution of a CPS board. And in hindsight, it doesn't help that Hudson put out an actually arcade-perfect version, or near enough, on Super Graphics in 1990 to really put Sega's port to shame. But we're not talking about a port for a failed Japan-only console from 1990, we are talking about the game that American kids could walk into the store and buy with their own cash money during the holiday 1989 season. By that standard, Ghouls and Ghosts was the most impressive and accurate arcade port you could find at the time. I mean, yes, Altered Beast fine, but Ghouls and Ghosts has a lot more going for it. This is not a game where you walk in a straight line and punch things until you become stronger or eventually bored. Ghouls and Ghosts demands quick reactions, some platforming skill, and actual tactical thinking. At its most basic level, Ghouls and Ghosts amounts to a fancier version of Ghosts and Goblins. It operates on the same principles as that game, having been built on the same bones, but offers more flexibility and options. Fundamentally, Arthur works the same as before. He starts his adventure wearing armor, but he can lose that by taking a single hit from an enemy. He chucks lances at the start, but can swap weapons if enemies drop their proper power-up. This time, however, he can acquire a more varied selection of weapons, including a sword, an axe, a spinning disc, and a firebomb. Each weapon has its advantages and drawbacks, and you really need to forge into each new area of the game with an understanding of its layouts and enemies, which will help you to understand which weapon will work best there. The disc, for example, fires rapidly and skims along the ground, but it's not nearly as powerful as the sword. But the sword only attacks within melee range, lacking a projectile quality. The axe fires upward at an angle, making it great against overhead enemies, but terrible against foes on the ground or positions below Arthur. The firebomb creates a short-range field of all-encompassing fire, but it has miserable vertical range. Oh right, in this game, Arthur can fire overhead. I guess designer Tokuro Fujiwara felt the need to get one over on his other creation, Mega Man. This makes for a more versatile hero than before, but also means that the level designers felt at liberty to stick more foes overhead and to challenge Arthur with more enemies that take multiple hits to destroy. And in order to counter that escalation, Arthur gains even more impressive powers. Every once in a while, you'll find a special suit of golden armor. Its power-up makes Arthur slightly more durable. If he takes damage from a head, it'll shatter his shield without breaking the armor, although a hit from behind will reduce him to his skivvies. More importantly, the golden armor allows Arthur to charge up a super attack, which varies depending on his current weapon. The more powerful his base weapon, the crappier its charge variant. The incredible disc generates a small, short-lived shield, which is almost useless. The limited and difficult sword, on the other hand, charges up to unleash a massive double ribbon of energy that swirls around the screen and takes out pretty much everything in sight. Of course, if you lose the golden armor, you lose your charge shot, and the golden armor plays a crucial role in completing the game. Unsurprisingly, surviving the miserable gauntlet that is Ghouls and Ghosts doesn't equate to beating the game. No, if you manage to defeat the final boss, you discover that there's still a finaler boss that you can only beat by returning to the beginning of the game and finding a specific weapon that can reveal the true enemy's lair. In this game, you can only find that special weapon by acquiring the golden armor and then uncovering a second of the rare treasure chests that grant you golden armor. This will cause the goddess of battle to emerge and grant you the powerful Psycho Cannon, the one weapon that can truly defeat Beelzebub and reveal the lair of Lucifer, which will then allow you to rescue Princess Prin and the people of her realm from hell. Of course, if you accidentally acquire a different weapon along the way, you're pretty much SOL, since it means you have to go through the whole double golden armor Psycho Cannon rigmarole all over again. All of which is to say that in terms of sheer obstinate playtime, this game may well offer the best value proposition of any game on Genesis. I am pretty sure that completing Ghouls and Ghosts amounts to a lifetime pursuit. Certainly, my life is too short for this nonsense. But even if this kind of unforgivingly cruel game design isn't my thing at all, I can at least admire the craftsmanship on display here. Ghouls and Ghosts has a mean streak, maybe needlessly so in this incarnation, but it's memorable. Every screen is its own action set piece, and the game consists of a string of challenges that stick around just long enough to establish a premise and build on their basic concept without wearing thin. The stages have a lot of variety in terms of both themes and layouts, and enemies are placed in such utterly devastating spots that you just know the original designers watched playtests, took notes, and specifically arranged encounters to screw over players for heeding their natural gameplay instincts. Arthur is much more capable here than in the original, but he also faces more daunting challenges. The game builds up to an utterly idiotic final stage, which begins with a gauntlet of red armors before pitting you against returning bosses, sometimes two at a time, including a dual showdown with the final boss of the original game, Astaroth. Absolutely cold-hearted. Still, it's an incredible looking game by 1989 standards. Bigger and more varied than Altered Beast, more complex and detailed than Legendary Axe, based on a popular series and with a shockingly high difficult level, but not in a stupid way like Last Battle. It's the kind of game that you might actually want to throw yourself against, overcoming increasingly impossible odds just so you can see and hear what comes next. And for the burgeoning console wars, it offers an impressive demonstration of what the Genesis could do over the NES. Or, for that matter, as an apples-to-apples comparison of the Genesis's power over Master System. But that is a sad story for another day. Next time on Segaiden, a perfect pairing, like lemonade and iced tea.